Hi, my name is Robert Webb. I am the face behind Brainstorm lore, and this is the second of 3 videos I'll be doing this month where I talk about the backstory and setting of Babylon Rocker, my upcoming sci-fi comic series. Last week I covered the broad strokes history and backstory of my own fictional universe. This week I'm going to be focusing on the setting itself, the kinds of technologies within the universe, the various factions, as well as many of the ideas that helped inspire me when I created this universe. And on that note, we start with the title, Babylon Rocker. Where'd that come from? Well, that was essentially inspired by my first reading of William Gibson's cyberpunk classic, Neuromancer. In the third act of Neuromancer, the characters travel to a space station called Zion, which is mostly populated by essentially Rastafarians in space. In the slang of Zion, Earth is referred to as Babylon, and a spaceship coming up from Earth towards Zion is referred to as Babylon Rocker. Essentially, I just liked the way that name sounded, and I decided that would be a good name for a spaceship, and by extension, a good name for the series. And so that is how Babylon Rocker got its name. Now that I've explained where I got my title from, let's dive into the setting first with the broad factions that comprise the universe of Babylon Rocker. First, of course, there are the neo-feudalists. These are essentially aristocrats in space, whether they be ruled by a monarch, singular, or a plural council of oligarchs. Generally, they are the majority of governments across human-occupied space, though these can come in 2 types. The first are those that are loyal to the empire that is the sole hegemon, while others are more the independents or separatists, those that are either part of the empire but wish to secede from it, or those that are independent already and wish to remain so. Then you've got the 2 revolutionary factions, the Aquinions, which are essentially the descendants, ideologically speaking, of Enlightenment liberalism in space. And then there are the Equitists, essentially the descendants, ideologically, of Marxism in space. Both the revolutionary factions obviously despise neo-feudalism and wish to bring it down, but of course they also despise one another, as their ideas are so radically different from one another. The Lockeans favoring freedom, while the Equitists, of course, emphasizing equality. 2 virtues that are never very comfortable with one another, even at the best of times. Then, of course, you have the major religions of Babylon Rocker. This idea mostly came to me because I'm an agnostic now, but even back when I was an atheist in my teens, I never really bought into the whole freedom from religion idea, simply because I figure that even if by some mad miracle the old gods of Judeo-Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc. were cast down, people would just find new things to call gods or even just regard as gods. And so you have Grahamism, the Syntyxi, the Usanam, and the Aquinian faith in Babylon Rocker. First, Grahamism, the most widespread of the 4 religions. The name kind of comes from a Hindi word meaning planet, and that kind of gives you an idea as to what it's all about, as Grahamism is essentially a religion that evolved out of contemporary environmentalism mixed with heavy neo-pagan overtones. Because it is the largest and most widespread belief system, Grahamism takes many different forms on many different worlds, but there are a few basic premises that unify them together. Your average Grahanist community will worship a fairly sizable pantheon of minor and major spirits, mostly based off of either important landmarks or certain species, endangered or keynote, anything that's very significant to the local ecosystem. And this even applies on terraformed worlds. Overall, there is the planet itself, which is referred to as the supreme god of that local pantheon. Other than that, anything goes, and a local Grahanist sect can come in all shapes and sizes. Generally, these sects can be arranged on a spectrum, ranging from having a fairly positive view of humans' relationship to nature, generally revolving around the idea that humanity exists as a sapient race to guard and protect the local environment, to the extremely negative one on the other end, where humanity is a curse, and you will even have essentially Grahanist death cults that will attempt religious suicide attacks to wipe out humanity. And it's not just humans. There was an incident where, on a local planet, they had discovered an alien race that, while not sentient, had the potential to become sentient, and it was nearly destroyed by the local Grahanists because they believe that any sentient race will eventually develop industrial technology which will be a threat to the environment. In point of fact, as I mentioned in my history and backstory video, the first emperor of the Sol Hegemon was in fact uber-religious. He was Grahanist, in fact, and this, according to some, was the reason why he tried to wipe out the human population of Earth, while others mostly just chalk it up to him being insane. Next, we have the Aquinions, the smallest religion in Babylon Rocker. In many ways, they are essentially a holdover from the days before the end of the Age of Democracy and the rise of the superstates. Where Grahamism is kind of a fusion of environmental radicalism and neo-paganism, Aquinian faith is mostly a fusion of Christianity and Buddhism. They believe in a single God with a purpose for mankind, but they also believe in reincarnation and the idea of reaching an elevated state of mind through contemplation of the world. At the same time, though, their faith is very science-oriented. Their name and the inspiration of their faith comes from the historical figure Thomas Aquinas, who once said, quote, "They hold a plainly false opinion, those who think that it does not matter what one knows about creation so long as one has the right opinion about God. False understanding of the creation ends as false thinking about God." The Aquinians believe that God is real and that he does have a purpose for mankind, but they believe that in order to understand that purpose, they must gain a better understanding of everything, namely the material universe through scientific exploration and the human condition through philosophy and faith. Their belief is that once mankind has acquired enough knowledge, they will be able to understand God's purpose and even one day commune with the Almighty himself. Until then, according to their belief, God speaks to man only through his universe and through human nature, and thus it is their duty to understand it. The average member of the Aquinian clergy, therefore, is kind of like a priest, a philosopher, and a scientist all rolled into one. As such, important historical theologians, philosophers, and scientists are all treated kind of like saints or bodhisattvas, to use the Buddhist equivalent, as they are treated as individuals who, through their powers of observation, apprehended aspects of the truth of God's universe. At the same time, however, because they believe that God speaks to all people through nature, it's just a question of whether humans comprehend what he is saying, they reject notions like the concept of a Messiah or a prophet, or the Jewish conception of a chosen people. Then you have the two that are kind of religions, but also kind of not: the Syntyxi cults and the Usanam cults. Although these two factions are great rivals and will in fact go to war with one another if they happen to be in the same neighborhood, they do have several things in common. The first being that, despite the name, neither the Syntyxi or the Usanam are exclusively comprised of religious groups. Some are ideological, without any spiritual overtones, whereas some versions are simply more treated as fads that are just lumped in together under these giant umbrella terms: Syntyxi, which comes from a Greek word meaning synthesis, and Usanam, which is derived from a compression of two different Korean words: Usahan, which means superior, and Namsong, which means man. The big difference between the two is that while both of them do aspire to advance the human species, they both have radically different ways of doing so. The Syntyxi want to do so through cybernetic enhancement, while the Usanam wish to do so through genetic engineering and modification. Obviously, given such broad parameters, these two factions have the most diversity in the different kinds of groups that you can find. For example, the Syntyxi have such subcults as the Mold, who believe in making all humans equal by giving them the same bionic implants. After all, if we all have the same bionic arms or bionic legs, say, we should all be able to do the same amount of physical labor. On the other hand, you have the Transients, who wish to achieve immortality by finding ways of converting the human consciousness into data and uploading them into computers. As for the Usanam, you have groups like the Viridians, who believe that they can find a way to make humans consume less resources by making them more plant-like, by finding a way to modify humans so that they have chlorophyll in their skin and can thus live off of sunlight. Unlike the Syntixi, however, the Usanam don't just limit themselves to modifying human beings. One group, calling themselves the Replacers, wish to, as the name suggests, find ways to genetically engineer organic life forms that can do the work of machines. Kind of like the Flintstones, only not as cartoonish. There are 3 other factions in Babylon Rocker, but these are neither political nor religious. First, there are the Earthers, the descendants of the remains of the population of Earth after the first emperor of the Sol Hegemon became an incredibly devout radical Grahanist and in a fit of religious-fueled insanity launched bioweapons to try and wipe out the human population of Earth. The Earthers utterly hate the Sol Hegemon for what it did to them, but they also hate everyone else, as no one, whether part of the Empire or independent, stood up for them or tried to help them reclaim Earth for themselves. And so the Earthers mostly float around space in their migrant fleets, harassing shipping and sometimes attacking lightly defended frontier planets. They are also very ethnocentric, as they are the last surviving remnants of the native cultures of Earth. The fact that they've barely survived eradication has caused them to double down on this. Next are the Zabarks. These were originally extended merchant clans that for a time were the only available means of transporting goods or information between systems. Nowadays, there are interstellar corporations that cover trade, so the Zabarks no longer have a monopoly on that, but they also are still fairly wealthy even now. And finally, there are the New Apes, and these are inspired not by Planet of the Apes, as you might think, but rather David Brin's Uplift books. The New Apes are mostly my concession to the fact that I didn't want to do any alien races in Babylon Rocker. Mostly because I've noticed that whenever there's a sci-fi universe with multiple races, including humans, the humans always end up coming off as just very bland and generic. And for the purposes of Babylon Rocker, I wanted to make all these different, interesting human societies and cultures. The New Apes are kind of my concession in that regard, because I really liked the concept of Brin's Uplift series of humanity taking certain species and genetically modifying them to make them sentient. The New Apes were created in the final years of the dissolution, when neo-feudalism was very much on the rise on Earth. At the same time, Grahamism was getting started, and one particularly fanatical scientist came to the conclusion that the only way that humanity would pay attention to those endangered species that managed to survive the rise of the superstates, the Second Cold War, and the dissolution would be if they could actually speak for themselves. And so he decided to basically uplift them, starting with the great apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, and orangutans. Unfortunately, this kind of genetic manipulation was seen as not kosher by the newly insurgent Grahanist faith, and he was essentially executed for the crime of playing God. But by then it was too late. His experiments had succeeded, and he had created apes that could talk and reason like men. Nowadays, in the current setting of Babylon Rocker, most new apes live among humans, though there are some planets where the apes are pretty much the only inhabitants. How they are treated by the humans kind of depends on the society they happen to be in. As a general rule, they're not abused, but they are also sometimes given a held at arm's length kind of treatment by the human population. However, there is one important legacy left over from their creation. Because their sentience was essentially artificially grafted onto the minds of animals, at least 1 in 4 new apes suffer from what is called atavism syndrome, where an ape can be essentially regressed into an animalistic state for a period of time. The effects are usually temporary, but still, it's not a very pleasant experience. Now for the actual setting. At this point, humanity has begun to expand along the Perseus arm of the Milky Way galaxy. But even with advanced terraforming technology, humanity has only managed to colonize about 100 habitable systems, over 2/3 of which were under the control of the Sol hegemon on the eve of the revolution. The story and the characters that we're going to follow take place in what is called the Ultimo sector, essentially 11 systems along the outer edge of the Perseus arm, essentially the boonies of human-occupied space. Faster-than-light travel is a thing in Babylon Rocker, but unlike most sci-fi universes where essentially it takes about an hour or even a day at most to just go from one system to the next, I wanted to more invoke the Age of Sail when it took weeks or even a month or two simply to cross the Atlantic. There is also artificial gravity, but the technology to create it is so large and cumbersome that it can only really be used on planetary bodies or the very largest of warships. Otherwise, artificial gravity on other space vessels is created much like it does in The Expanse, through a combination of thrust and inertia, or centrifugal force in the case of space stations. Overall, Babylon Rocker leans more hard sci-fi than soft. There is power armor, but only for elite members of the neo-feudalist warrior caste. There are walkers, mechs, and anti-grav vehicles, but only on low-gravity worlds where that sort of thing is more practical than, say, treaded tanks or wheeled vehicles. There is cryostasis, and this actually ties into piracy. Because space is so vast, and even with FTL it takes a while to get from point A to point B, it's simply impossible to patrol all of the space between two systems. Generally, the preferred pirate tactic is to set the ship's computer on autopilot, put the crew in cryosleep, and then, when the computer senses a likely target, defrost the crew so that they can launch their attack. The last thing I want to talk about with regards of the setting for this video is its overall aesthetic. Now, I have nothing against the trend in sci-fi towards dark and gritty, but honestly, I'm kind of tired of it, and I want my sci-fi to be bright and colorful. As such, I would be remiss not to mention what was arguably the biggest influence on the look of Babylon Rocker, the 1990s anime Outlaw Star. I watched this series back when I was a kid while it was airing on Toonami, and the thing that I remember most about Outlaw Star, apart from some of the cool character and ship designs, was the colors. Specifically, the colors of space. In Outlaw Star, space isn't a black void with little white dots for stars. Instead, you have nebulae of bright red, emerald green, and golden yellow against these beautiful dark blue or indigo skies, with the stars hanging like gold and silver spangles. In fact, when I initially began communicating with my co-creator and artist Utku, I sent him images of space scenes from Outlaw Star and saying, I want Babylon Rocker to look like this. I want space to look like this. Rather than have my universe look cold, dark, and empty, I want it to be bright and colorful and full of possibilities. Above all, I wanted to evoke the kind of wonder that got a lot of people like me into science fiction to begin with. Because ultimately, for all my talk about political and religious factions, I didn't write Babylon Rocker to be deep or intellectual, mostly because I don't consider myself to be very deep or intellectual. I just wanted an excuse to take all these different elements from all my favorite science fiction and cram them together into one universe while still making some degree of sense. Ultimately, I created Babylon Rocker because I wanted to have fun. And my hope is that if this project ever gets off the ground and people actually read it, then my hope is that they will have fun too. And on that note, part 2 ends. Next week, I talk about the most important part of my story, frankly, the most important part of any story, the characters. Until then.